Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. Today, we'll go into the dark woods of Kentucky. The Appalachian peaks are hiding secrets that time won't let out. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments if you are going to be there. Let's work together to find out what happened in those faraway places. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, live or dead, is just a coincidence. The year was 1916. It was in a mess. And even in the most remote parts of the United States, people heard about the war through late newspapers and traveler tales. But in the Kentucky woods, especially in the farther flung parts of Leslie County, life went on as usual, with no thought to the big events going on around them. There were small towns spread out in deep valleys and on steep slopes. The morning mist remained, and the only sounds were the rushing water of icy streams and the wind whistling through the pines. In that area, families had been friends for many years. Each person was known for where they lived and what they farmed. It made sense to be wary of strangers. Sometimes the roads were just wet paths that wound up the mountain, making them very dangerous. It took resolve to get there, and not many people went there without a clear reason. People there took care of their own business. County law didn't show up very often, and secrets could grow in the shade of the old trees. In this place, Rosie Hale made herself at home. She moved from a bigger city to the south, and her neighbors were interested in her because she seemed mysterious. Rosie lived by herself in a dark wooden house that was almost 2 kilometers away from the main road. She didn't speak to the other families. There were neighborhood meetings and a small church that people could gather at, but she didn't go to either. She would go to the closest store when she needed food, buy what she needed in silence, and come back before anyone could start talking. The locals thought about. Some said she had left a bad marriage. Some people whispered that she was hiding something worse. No one was sure what made her run away to the woods, but she did. Rosie didn't say anything to explain, and her always serious face made people not want to ask questions. Their dark eyes seemed to carry an unseen weight, and the sadness in them made them not want to talk to me. The house she lived in was simple but clean. Even on the hottest days, smoke always came up from the chimney, as if something that had to stay warm 24/7. At night, a dim light flashed in the windows, and sounds could sometimes be heard resonating through the valley. People walking by on the nearby path said they could hear murmurs, which sounded like Rosie was talking to someone. She did live alone, though. That's what everyone thought, at least. Roz became a part of the scenery over the course of the months. People got used to her being alone. In the woods, after all, everyone had the right to be alone. But, after that, things started to shift. Few small things that didn't mean anything on their own, but added up to a disturbing trend. The first signs showed up slowly, almost unnoticeably. There was something odd about Rose's shopping habits that made the store owner, Thomas Brennan, start to notice them. That's what she always bought: flour, salt, canned goods, and kerosene for the candles. But starting in the fall of that year, she bought different things. She started to buy a lot more food, always 2 or 3 times as much as normal. Amount. Thomas said something casually and asked if she was going to have guests over. Rosie just shook her head in a mean way and walked away without saying anything. Even more interesting was the fact that she started buying medicines, but not the usual ones for colds or daily aches and pains. Instead, she bought specific tonics, medicines to treat wounds, and thick bandages. When the salesman advised that she see the traveling doctor who came to the area once a month, Rosie told him in a cold voice that she took care of her own problems. There was something strong in her voice, the voice that ended the talk. At the same time, the sounds coming from the cabin got louder and more disturbing. The property next door, Martha Coleman, which was about a mile away, started telling her friends that she heard strange things at night. They didn't just murmur, sounds that sounded like faint moans, like someone was in pain but couldn't scream. Martha tried to get her husband to look into it, but he wouldn't. He told them it didn't matter what Rosie did on their land. Time of year. Mountain scenery changed along with them. The winter of 1917 was very harsh, with blizzards that made the towns even more spread out. For weeks, the tracks could not be used. No one saw Rosie at this point. She was still alive because smoke kept coming up from her chimney. She didn't go down to buy food or water at all during that hard winter. Rosie showed up at the store again when spring finally melted the snow and the roads could be used again. She was different, though. Her face, which was already thin, looked even more hollow. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were a little shaky as she paid with cash. Thomas Brennan asked her how she was doing after the winter. Rosie only nodded and said something in a low voice about being sick but getting better. The orders, on the other hand, got bigger again, and something new came up. For some reason, she started buying a lot of lime. He was interested in this because lime was usually used to treat dirt, or for certain, for health reasons. Thomas was interested, but he didn't ask. With Rosie Hale, there was an unwritten line that no one crossed. At that point, something happened that made the first sound break through the wall of quiet. Samuel Pritchard, a hunter, was following a hurt deer down the hills when he accidentally came closer to Rosie's land than he meant to. He knew he was close to the house because he was following the animal's blood trail. The sun was starting to go down. After seeing the sky turn orange and red, Samuel chose to go back. But something caught his eye before he turned around. A small wooden shed that he had never seen before was behind the house, in a spot that was partly hidden by tall trees. The door was open and moving a little in the wind. Samuel normally wouldn't bug people, but his interest got the best of him. He slowly walked up, trying not to make any noise. What he saw through the door's crack made him feel very cold. They were homemade, shelves with glass bottles of dark drinks on them. Some of the tools on the walls were stained with something Samuel didn't want to say. On the floor, something that looked like he couldn't finish the thought was partly covered by a dirty cloth. His heart was beating fast, so he quickly backed away and left the place as fast as he could without running. Samuel told his wife what he had seen when he got home, but he made her promise not to tell anyone else. He wasn't sure what he had seen for himself, and he didn't want to spread stories that might not be true. But the doubt had been planted, and it would start to grow in strange ways over time. Stranger things happened in the weeks that followed. Rosie was first seen walking along the paths at dusk, always by herself and carrying heavy bags. When she came across someone, she would quickly look away and walk faster. Her stance showed that she was carrying a heavy load, not just physically but also emotionally and spiritually. Next door, when her name was brought up, they looked at each other deeply, but no one did anything. They could show she hadn't done anything wrong with the law, and privacy was sacred in the mountains of Kentucky, even when it came to creepy mysteries. The slopes were very hot in the summer. The air was thick and wet, and the wind that usually blew through the valleys didn't seem to be there. At this point, Martha Coleman knew she had to do something. The sounds at night coming from Rosie had become more dangerous, and Martha could no longer sleep soundly. It wasn't just muffled moans. There were now steady thumps, like something heavy was being dragged across the wood floor. Martha talked 2 other women in the community into going with her on an unplanned visit. As an excuse, they used a freshly baked apple pie, which is a usual thing to do in that part of the neighborhood. It wasn't a very good reason, but it worked. The 3 women climbed the trail early one August morning. The sun wasn't quite at its highest point yet. The road was steep, so you had to stop often. They saw that the front door was closed when they finally found the house, but the window curtains were moving. Martha rang the bell. keep quiet. It was her second, stronger knock. They heard slow, hesitant footsteps coming from the other side. Rosie walked through the small crack when the door finally opened. Even paler, almost see-through, her face was marked with dark circles under her eyes. That made me think of restless nights. She did not say anything, just looked at the guests with a face that showed a mix of wonder and fear. Martha put on a fake smile and held out the pie. Rosie thought about it for a while and then agreed. As usual, the women were expecting to be called inside, but Rosie stayed in the doorway, blocking their view of what was inside. Martha tried to start a chat by talking about the weather and the crops, but Rosie could only say one word in response. There was a noticeable strain in the air, and the discomfort grew with each second that went by. At that moment, Elizabeth Murray, one of the women, saw something odd. She could see part of the inside of the cabin through the crack in the door. What she saw made her feel bad. There were dark stains on the wooden floor that looked like they had been rubbed over and over again, but were still there. There were also things hanging on the walls that she couldn't quite name, but didn't seem to belong in a normal room. Dwelling. Rosie took a step back when she saw Elizabeth's interested look. She almost shut the door behind her and thanked her in a shaking voice for the pie. She then said she was busy and needed to get back to work. The door slammed shut, and they heard the lock click into place on the other side, before Martha could say anything. The three women stood there for a while, looking at each other with puzzled looks. Something very wrong was proven by what had just happened. Elizabeth couldn't hold back her thoughts on the way back. She talked about the marks on the floor and the strange things on the walls. Martha also said Rosie looked scared, like she was trying to hide something bad. Sarah Bennett, the third lady, said that they might want to tell the county sheriff, but Martha wasn't sure. The sheriff lived more than 30 kilometers away, and filing a report without proof could lead to trouble. In any case, they couldn't prove that Rosie had done anything wrong. All of it was based on hopes and fears, but their worries grew when, a few days later, a smell started to spread through the area. There were times when it was always hot, but only when the wind blew in the right direction. It smelled sweet and sickening, like something breaking down. The neighbors first thought that an animal had died nearby, which happens a lot in forests. But the smell wouldn't go away and seemed to be coming from Rosie's land. The store owner, Thomas Brennan, had a private talk, and some men from the neighborhood. He talked about Ross's strange purchases, especially the big amounts of lime. People knew that lime could get rid of smells and speed up the breakdown process. It was used in graves and other places where cleanliness was important. Why does a woman need so much lime by herself? There was no answer to the question. Samuel Pritchard, the shooter who had seen the shed months before, finally made up his mind to talk about it. He talked about the jars and the dirty tools, the thing on the floor that was hidden. There was a heavy pause after he spoke. The men looked at each other, each thinking about what was being said and what it meant. The proof was hard to ignore, but no one wanted to believe it. Someone needed to look into it more, it was agreed. But who is it, and what power do they have? The sheriff was too far away to help without strong proof, and no one wanted to face Rosie directly, not after how she acted when the women came to visit. There was also fear. They are afraid of what they might find. They were afraid that their worst fears would come true. While everyone else in the community talked in silence, Rosie went about her alone time. She was being watched now, though. Everyone saw her every move. Everyone who went to the store was talked about. She seemed to be aware that she was being watched by an unseen web of people. Every day, her shoulders hunched more, like the weight of the stairs was making them hurt. And on nights with no moon, when the darkness swallowed the mountains, The sounds from her cabin echoed through the valley like scary warnings that something bad was going on that no one was brave enough to face yet. As autumn came to 1917, the colors of the mountains changed. The temperature started to slowly drop, and the trees were dressed in shades of gold and red. Around this time, a stranger showed up in the area. He said his name was Daniel Whitmore, and that he was from a lumber company that wanted to look at the local woods that could be used for business purposes. The only guest house that was open was a simple one run by a woman named Eleanina Price. Daniel was a middle-aged guy who dressed nicely for the area and was polite but quiet. As he walked along the paths and took notes in a black notebook, he always heard people talking about Rosie Hale in whispers. At first, he wasn't interested and was focused on his work. As the days went by and he learned more, though, his interest grew, peaked. In the boarding house's common room one evening, Daniel sat next to Thomas Brennan by the fire. There was some light talk about the weather and the crop at first, but Thomas, maybe because of the drink that warmed his hands, started to talk about Rosie. He talked about the strange things he bought, how alone he felt, and the stories that were going around. Daniel paid close attention and asked pointed questions that showed he was interested. Thomas didn't know that Daniel Whitmore wasn't the person he said he was. In the past, he worked as a private investigator in Louisville, even though he now appraises land. Even though he quit his job as a detective after a bad case, his instincts never left him totally. The stories about Rosie Hale sparked that old desire to investigate again. Daniel began to ask more specific questions over the next few days. He talked to Martha Coleman, who told him about the scary visit to the house. He talked to Samuel Pritchard, who would not let him. He told them what he saw in the shed. Daniel was mentally putting together a puzzle, and each talk added a piece to it. As more pieces fit together, the picture got darker. Daniel chose to check it out for himself. On a cloudy afternoon, he put on his backpack and left on a walk that he told Mrs. Price would take him to the northern edge of the area to look at a certain forest area. His real goal, though, was Rosie Hale's land. He planned his trip so that it would take him close to the cabin. There were wooded places where he could watch without being seen. He got there late in the afternoon, just as the leaves on the trees were starting to get longer. He hid behind a thicket of pine trees that gave him a partial view of the house and shed Samuel had mentioned. And then he waited. The forest was very quiet. The only sounds were the distant songs of a few nocturnal birds and the odd rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Like always in the woods, night fell quickly. A dim light, most likely from an oil lamp, showed up in the bedroom window. Daniel did not move from where he was standing and kept his eyes on the building. Hours went by with nothing interesting happening. Around midnight, the cell door opened, making him start to think that he had wasted his time. Rosie came out with something heavy wrapped in a dark cloth. She had a hard time moving and had to stop many times to change the weight in her arms. Daniel's heart was beating fast. She walked over to the shed and went inside. The light. Shadows that were not straight came through the cracks in the wooden planks from the lamp she carried. Daniel could hear sounds that were hard to make out. Movements, and something being pulled. He kept looking for more than an hour. Rosie didn't have anything with her when she finally came out of the shed. Her hands looked dirty, and as she walked back into the house, she couldn't help but rub them on her skirt. The door shut. The window light went out, and the night became quiet again. Daniel was sure he had seen something important, but he wasn't sure what it was. What? He had more and more doubts, but they weren't proof. He needed more. He decided to take a closer look at the shed the next morning, as soon as Rosie left the house to go shopping at the sale. He knew it was dangerous and might even be against the law, but he couldn't ignore what was going on there. He slept restlessly at the inn the rest of the night, going over what he was going to do in his mind. At dawn, he laid down close again, but this time he had a clear plan. Around 8 a.m., they saw Rosie leave the cabin and follow the trail to the shop. He knew it would be at least 2 hours before she came back. He had enough time to be careful. He walked up to the shed with a beating heart. A simple bolt locked the door. He opened it after taking a deep breath and making sure he was by himself. Everything would be different after seeing what was inside. Not only would it change how you think about the case, but it would also change what happened to that whole small mountain town in Kentucky. The shed had. There were truths that no one was ready to face. Secrets that would be hard for even the most skilled detectives to figure out. Daniel stood still at the warehouse door for a long time while his eyes got used to the dim light inside. He was hit with a strong smell. A mix of chemicals, wet ground, and an organic substance that he wasn't sure what it was. The shelves Samuel had mentioned were there, filled with bottles of different sizes. Some contained clear liquids, others dark and viscous. Some of them had labels made by hand. They were written in handwriting that was hard to read because there wasn't much light. In the other area, a collection of disturbing tools were hung on the wall. There were different-sized wounds, long knives, and things that looked like they were used for medical or surgical reasons. Daniel wasn't an expert in these areas, but he knew that some things shouldn't be in the hands of a normal person. A stack of damaged fabrics was stacked next to the tools. The fabrics were folded in a way that looked like they had been used and reused more than once. But what really interested him was in the middle of the shed. A strong wooden table that had been used a lot and become darker over time took up a lot of the room. It had a lot of scratches and deep designs on its surface. Some spots looked like they would never go away because they were soaked into the wood. Metal buckets and more fabrics were stacked under the table. Daniel slowly walked up, trying to figure out what the point of that layout was. That's when he saw something in the shed's corners. The clay floor had marks that looked like something heavy had been dragged back and forth from the front of the building to the back. He used his eyes to follow the marks and saw that they led to a spot with loose planks on it. His natural desire to find out more told him to lift those planks, but he wasn't sure. He knew he was about to cross the line between being interested and breaking the law. He looked at his watch. He still had time. He carefully began to with shaking hands. Try not to make a sound as you take the boards off. The wood was heavy and wet. When he finally took off the big pieces, a hole in the floor was seen. A kind of homemade cellar dug into the ground. All of that darkness was down there. Daniel lit a match. The light from it was briefly visible. What the light showed him made him naturally pull away. There were things going down into that underground room, like a small, rough wooden staircase, and down there he could just barely make out shapes wrapped around each other in flashing light. The fabric is grouped in a neat way. Even though he couldn't make out the specifics, the implication was too strong for him to dismiss. He dropped the match and went back into the darkness as his fingers burned. Daniel needed a little time to calm down again. It turned out that his worst fears were true, but he needed more solid proof before making any choices. He carefully put the boards back where they belonged, making sure to leave everything just the way he found it. He took another look around the shed and made a mental note of everything he saw. Then, he went outside in silence and shut the door, making sure the bolt was back where it belonged. He quickly left the property, but his heart was still beating fast. After he thought about what he had found, he chose what to do with it. It would not be possible to go back to the boarding house and act like nothing happened. But going up against Rosie by yourself would be careless, and maybe even risky. The smart thing to do would be to find the sheriff, but that would take time, and he wasn't sure if the police were still around. He had strong reasons to believe something without more solid proof. He spent the rest of the day walking around the trails and trying to get his ideas in order. Elelonina Price said that he seemed upset when he got back to the inn at night. Daniel didn't seem to care. He said he got lost on the trails and stayed out longer than planned in the hot sun. Even though she gave him tea and a hot meal, he barely touched it. Daniel made a choice that night while lying in his narrow bed. He would go to town and look for the sheriff by himself. He was going to talk about everything he had found, including what the residents had said and what he had seen himself. Even if it took days to persuade the authorities that what he was doing was the right thing to do, he couldn't just leave the situation. His morals wouldn't let him do it. But fate had other ideas. The next morning, before Daniel could leave, there was a lot of noise in the small town. Martha Coleman was very upset when she got to the store, agitated and talking quickly about something that happened in the night. Rosie Hale came down from her cabin before dawn and pounded on Martha's door, making it clear that she was desperate. Rosie had asked for help for the first time since she got to those mountains. Daniel joined the other people who lived in the area who had gathered at the store to hear Martha's story. Her story was that Rosie was in a terrible state. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her hair was a mess, and her eyes were red from crying. She said she couldn't stand it, the wait any longer, that she had to say sorry, and that she would never be forgiven for what she had done. Martha tried to calm Rosie down, but the woman was almost speechless, switching between sobs and mumblings that Martha couldn't understand. Thomas Brennan told someone to check on the cabin and see if everything was okay. Daniel volunteered right away, and he was joined by Samuel Pritchard and 2 other men from the neighborhood. As they climbed the trail, there was a tense silence. Each of them was thinking about something else, ideas about what they could find. The mountains were lit up by a golden sun in the morning, which stood in stark contrast to the darkness of what they were about to find. There was no way that the walk to the cabin could have been more than 20 minutes. The group walked in a straight line, with Daniel in the lead because he had seen more of the path over the past few days. Samuel was right behind them. He carried his rifle, not because he planned to use it, but because it was safe to do so in the mountains. It was common to be ready for anything that could happen. Jacob Foster and William Hayes, the other 2 men, walked along in silence and looked at each other nervously when they saw the cabin through the trees. In the day, the place looked different. The air was so still that it made you feel uneasy. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area. In the morning breeze, the front door was open and swaying a little. Daniel told the others to stop, then walked up to Rosie by herself and called her name. Nothing. He slowly opened the door. The sound of the hinges creaking echoes in a scary way. Surprisingly, the inside of the cabin was very clean. Simple furniture that has been well taken care of, a small kitchen with clean dishes hung on the wall, and a bed made up neatly in a corner. But there were also things that were upsetting. The stains on the floor that Elizabeth had talked about were worse than they looked at first because of the crack in the door. Even though they were scrubbed hard, some of the dirt had been absorbed by the wood, leaving dark, permanent marks. Shades. Hand-drawn diagrams were hung from hooks on the walls. Daniel walked up to look at them more closely. They were surprisingly accurate and detailed diagrams of the human body. They showed organ systems, internal structures, proportions, and measurements written in the edges. The writing was fine but firm, just like the writing on the jar labels in the shed. On the wall were also torn pages from medical books that were nailed up. Some of the pages were so old that the paper was yellow and crumbly. Samuel went into the cabin behind Daniel, and then the others came after him. There was silence as they all looked and tried to figure out what they saw. He pulled out a wooden box from under the bed and put it outside. Inside, there were dozens of notebooks, each one full of careful notes. Daniel picked one at random and started to read it. There were dated records, clinical observations, and descriptions of procedures on the pages. The language was very technical and almost scientific, but the situation made it sound like something very scary. He looked at one entry and liked it. Signed, March of that year. It went into great detail about a way to preserve things using certain chemicals. It said the best temperatures, how long to expose it, and what effects to expect. Daniel had a chill go up and down his back. This wasn't just any person's work. There was some knowledge there. Training was a method that implied previous knowledge. William, who was still near the door, called for the others. He found something in a small room that was closed off from the rest of the cottage by a curtain. It was a kind of makeshift office with a table covered in papers, stacked books, and more bottles containing various liquids. A picture in a frame on the table, though, really caught his eye. A guy with gray hair and a white lab coat stood next to Rosie, who was dressed in a suit and many years younger. Behind them, there was a sign on the wall that, even though it wasn't clear in the picture, looked like it was from a medical facility. Daniel looked at the picture more carefully. At the bottom, there was a note written in worn ink. He could only make out some of the words, but he thought he saw a name, and the year 1898. In other words, the picture was taken almost 20 years ago. Even though Rosie looked about 20 in the shot, she is now in her 40s. But who was the man next to her, and what kind of place was it? It was time for the men to check the shed. That's where they would find the strongest proof if their theories were right. They got out of the cabin and walked the 50 meters that kept them apart from the smaller building. When Samuel opened the bolt, Daniel's stomach hurt. This time, light was coming in through the cracks in the boards. The inside was easier to see than the last time they were there. The shelves with jars, the hanging tools, and the marked table were all just the way he remembered them. But now that 4 sets of eyes were looking at everything, new things were seen. There was a simple ventilation system in the roof, with metal pipes that led outside, most likely to spread the smell. Some parts of the walls were covered with lime, which was probably done to stop the growth of fungi and germs. Jacob walked up to the shelves and started reading the bottle labels. Some had names of drugs that he thought he knew from talking with the visiting doctor. Formaldehyde, ethyl alcohol, and saltwater solutions. Others he had no idea at all about. There were also cases with what looked like preserved specimens inside, but it was hard to tell what they were made of because the clear glass and liquid that isn't clear. Daniel knew it was time to tell everyone what he had found on the ground. He directed our attention to the shaky boards and quickly explained that there was a space below. The tension was clear as the other 3 guys looked at each other. They didn't want to be the first ones to look, but they all knew they had to. Samuel took charge because he was the oldest and had the most experience in the group. Since Daniel had already weakened the boards the day before, it was easier for them to take them down again. It turned out that the opening was bigger than it looked at first. About 2 meters of rough stairs led to the bottom. Samuel carefully climbed down while his friends watched from above with bated breath. He picked up a lamp that he had seen hanging on the wall. The lamplight lit up the underground area slowly. They carefully dug it out to make a kind of room about 3 square meters big, which was bigger than they thought it would be. Planks were used to strengthen the dirt walls so they wouldn't fall down. Because of the roof, Samuel had to stoop, but what was important was on the walls. At different levels, wooden structures that looked like shelves or bunk beds were built. On top of these structures were shapes made of fabric and tied together with ropes. Samuel numbered them in silence. 6 all together. Different forms and sizes. Some looked like they had been there longer. Some were obviously more recent. Even though there was airflow, the smell of chemicals was strong. However, there was also a smell of breakdown that the condoms couldn't totally hide. Samuel didn't do anything. He just watched, took notes, and then climbed back up, his face pale and serious. When he came out of the hole, everyone asked him a lot of questions. He just shook his head, though. He told them that they needed to call the police right away because this was too big for them to handle on their own. There was proof of things that should only be looked at by trained agents and police officers. Daniel completely. I agreed. He told them that 2 of them should stay on the land to make sure nothing was changed, and the other 2 should go into town to get the sheriff. It was already very hot, and they could be back with the police the next day if they left right away. Samuel and William offered to go on the trip because they were the best horsemen in the group and knew the fastest way to get through the mountains. Daniel and Jacob were told to set up a secret camp nearby as the 2 got ready to leave, where they could keep watch without being seen in case Rosie came back. But there was one question that everyone had. Where did Rosie go? Martha said she left after her broken statement and ran off down the trail before anyone could catch her. Was she on the run, or did she have something else in mind? The afternoon went by slowly. Daniel and Jacob switched off who stayed awake at night while the others slept. Both the house and the shed were quiet and empty. Nothing moving and no sign of life. It looked like the place had been left empty. Years ago, Rosie had been there the night before, doing her shady things in the dark. As the sun went down and turned the sky orange and purple, Daniel thought about everything they had learned. There was proof that something was planned, organized, and done with technical skill. Rosie wasn't a killer who killed without thinking. She was a person who knew what she was doing, someone who turned that mountain house into a beautiful home. Place set aside for reasons that were hard to understand, and the questions kept coming up. Who were those people who were kept alive in the basement? Where did they come from? How did Rosie get them to go to that faraway spot? The most important question is why? What was the point of it all in the end? As night fell over the Kentucky mountains, it was cold like fall, and the sky was full of stars, which stood in stark contrast to the day's discoveries, which were mostly dark. Daniel and Jacob stayed alert because they knew what was going to happen in the next few hours. Important. Rosie Hale was free somewhere in those endless mountains. She had the secrets that could explain the horrible things they had left behind with her. Daniel had never had a night like the one he had in the woods. It wasn't really quiet. There was a symphony of soft sounds that were enhanced by the darkness. Dry leaves rustling, the howl of coyotes in the distance, and the crackling of dry twigs every once in a while. He thought that every sound was Rosie coming back to their land, which made his heart race. But the hours went by and there was no action. The shack stayed dark and quiet, making it stand out more against the night sky. He fell asleep while resting against a tree, and Daniel kept watch. He couldn't take his mind off of the picture they found in the house. The man in the lab coat, the hospital in the background, the young man with the bright smile, and what seemed to be a good reputation. There was a story, a past, that would surely explain at least some of what she had changed into. Daniel wished he had the picture with him, but they didn't let him. They promised not to take anything from the spot, so it would stay there until the police could look into it. Daniel woke up Jacob just as the first lights of dawn started to show up over the horizon, giving the sky a blue tint. To plan their day, they had to decide what to do. It wasn't possible to stay there forever. They only brought water and a few cookies, which was enough for one day, or maybe 2 if they were careful. However, Samuel and William wouldn't come back with the sheriff before it got dark at best. Jacob suggested that they go to the store to get food and let the other people living there know what was going on. They could come back later, which would let everyone in the neighborhood know what was going on. Daniel was hesitant at first because he didn't want to leave the property unattended, but he saw that the idea was a good one. Also, they were interested in hearing about Rosie and seeing if anyone had seen her. As the sun rose fully, they came down the trail, lighting up the valleys and hills with that warm, golden light of mornings in the fall. The air was still cool, and their breath made little clouds of steam. The people got to the store around 7 a.m. and found Thomas Brennan already there opening it. He looked surprised when he saw them, but his face quickly turned worried when he saw how serious they looked. Daniel and Jacob talked about everything they had found inside the shop, where hot coffee was warming their hands. Thomas listened in silence, and as the facts came out, his face got paler. Found out. After they were done, he was quiet for a long time as he thought about what they had said. Finally, he said in a low voice that he had always known Rosie was seriously ill, but he had never thought it would be this bad. Soon after, Martha Coleman showed up, followed by Elizabeth Murray and other women from the neighborhood. People were eager to learn more about the event as it was becoming known. Daniel told the story again, but this time he left out some of the more upsetting parts too. Please be kind to the people who are there. But the main point was clear. Nobody could fully understand what Rosie Hale was doing on her remote property, but it had been turned into a place for practices that everyone knew were bad. Martha said that Rosie hadn't come home since she left early the previous morning. On any of the big trails, no one had seen her, and it looked like she had just disappeared into the mountains. Some people thought she might have gone to the valley on. On the other side of the mountain range, there was a road that went to bigger towns. Some people thought she might have hidden in one of the many natural holes in the area. It was at that moment that Daniel understood something important. Rosie had only taken the clothes on her back if she had really run away. She had left behind all of her things, including her carefully filled-out notes and all the proof of what she had done. For someone who was planning a real escape, this didn't make any sense. Someone with her level of order and method would have planned a way to get away, destroyed proof, and taken important papers. Thomas brought up an option that no one wanted to think about. Maybe her desperate confession to Martha wasn't part of a plan, but a real breakdown. Did Rosie really run away? What if she had instead looked for a quiet place to end her own story? The mountains had many cliffs, deep rivers, and other places where someone could escape without a trace. Martha spoke out against it, saying that despite. Rosie earned the chance to explain what she did and face justice the right way, but the thought of that possibility hung over the talk. As the morning went on, more people from the neighborhood came into the store, turning it into a sort of makeshift command center. Someone suggested putting together search parties to look for Rosie, but Daniel was against it. He said it was risky for regular people to search the woods for someone who might be desperate and bad at planning ahead. It was. It would be better to wait for the police who would come with the right tools and know-how to make things right. Then some news that no one saw coming. Herbert Lewis, who lived on a farm far away to the southeast, showed up and said he had seen something strange the night before. Around midnight, he was awake and taking care of a sick cow when he heard someone rushing along the road that went by his land. He lit a lamp and went outside to look into it. When he got there, he saw a woman going into the darkness, quickly moving toward the mountain's more remote parts. Herbert hadn't been able to see her face, but she looked a lot like Rosie in terms of height and gait. She was going in a way that didn't lead to any known property. Instead, it led to wild places that not many people went. In that area, there were some empty buildings, like old hunters' houses and a sawmill that hadn't been used in decades. Rosie might have known some of these spots and was hiding there. What Daniel and Jacob thought it was. It's time to go back to the observation post close to Ross's house. They had to be there to show the sheriff around and give him all the information they had gathered if he did show up that afternoon as planned. Daniel asked Thomas to show him everything he could remember about the things Ross has bought in the last few years before they left. Thomas often kept simple records. They weren't very detailed, but they might help us figure out when her actions happened. The records showed an pattern is interesting. About 18 months before, at the start of 1916, Ross's orders were very different. Before that, she had only bought the most basic things, the right amount for someone living alone. From that point on, though, the numbers went up a lot, and strange things started showing up on the lists. Specialized tools, chemicals, and a lot of cloth. During that time, something had changed. Something that pushed her to start or step up her bad behavior. Daniel in his mind. 18 months after registering this information. In other words, there might have been proof from that time up to the present day. If what he thought the shapes in the basement meant was true, then many people had gone missing or been pulled to Rosie's house during that time. Who were these people, though? Tourists? Strangers? Few strangers came to the area, and surely people would notice and talk about disappearances. This thought brought up another troubling question. What if the people in question weren't from the area? What if Rosie knew how to bring in outsiders, people whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed or looked into right away? Traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, and people on the run would sometimes use the roads that went through the mountains. These were people who didn't have strong ties to the area and whose families weren't looking for them, so they could leave without making a big splash. Daniel and Jacob finally got back to their lookout point, but the sun was already very high in the sky. The house stayed. It was empty and quiet. They set up camp again among the trees, this time with extra food that Thomas insisted on bringing. The wait began again, but this time there was a stronger feeling of purpose. The police would arrive in a few hours and start their official probe. Daniel used the time to go over everything they knew in his head. An old picture that makes it look like Roz had a medical or scientific link, detailed notebooks full of technical language, and a shed that was set up as a kind of the lab or procedure room, the basement with the proof that has been kept safe, and the desperate escape after a broken confession. Even though each piece was troubling on its own, when put together they painted a picture that hinted at more than just crime. Rosie was the only one who could understand the reasoning behind what she was doing, which was based on a flawed set of assumptions. The weather changed in the afternoon. The wind picked up, and dark clouds started to form over the mountaintops. There was a storm coming up, which is normal for that time of year, but always impressive at high elevations. Daniel feared for Samuel and William and hoped they could get back before it rained and blocked the paths. As the clouds started to cover the sun and the first raindrops fell, Daniel heard sounds coming from the main road. He was expecting the sound of horses racing, but instead heard slow, dragging footsteps. Jacob was told to be quiet, and he and his partner moved to see what was going on. Who was coming up? Daniel's heart stopped for a moment when he saw the person coming around the bend in the trail. It was Rosie Hale. She had come back. Her clothes were torn and dirty, with leaves and mud all over them. The hair that was usually in a tight bun fell over her shoulders in a messy way. But what stood out the most was the look on her face. There was no sadness or fear. There was only a deep acceptance, as if she had already made up her mind and was okay with what would happen. Rosie went straight to the cabin without looking to the left or right, as if they didn't notice that it was getting rainier. She shut the door behind her as she went inside. Soon after, light came in through the windows. She was waiting inside, but for what? As for the sheriff, who had come to arrest her for some reason that she alone knew about. Daniel and Jacob looked at each other, not sure what to do. Should they talk to her? Should they just wait some more? The choice was made when, less than an hour later, at last, I heard the sound of horses. There were other people with Samuel and William as they came back. They were joined by 3 men on strong horses who were wearing raincoats. There they were, the sheriff of Leslie County with 2 guards. It was almost time for the real investigation to start. Maybe this would lead to the answers to the dark riddles that had been haunting those mountains for so long. Sheriff Harold Mason was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, had a thick beard, and looked right into your soul. showed decades of skill handling all sorts of situations. The mountains in Kentucky could show. Both of his younger deputies carried guns and looked like they were ready for anything. When they got off their horses, Daniel and Jacob were already waiting for them. Samuel quickly introduced them while the rain got worse. Daniel told the sheriff everything, from what people in the town thought at first to what they found in the cabin in the shed. Mason listened without speaking up, and his face stayed the same. Even though he didn't show any emotion, his eyes showed how seriously he was taking everything in. Daniel told the sheriff that Rosie had come back and was now inside the house. The sheriff slowly nodded and began to tell his men what to do. A careful but firm method would be taken. Mason made it clear that he didn't want any extra aggression and also wasn't willing to take any chances. One of the cops stood on the side of the cabin so he could see the back door in case Rosie tried to get out that way. One stayed near the main door with a rifle pointing down and in their hand. He then went to the door and knocked 3 times, each time loudly and intentionally. The silence seemed to last for a very long time. The rain hitting the roof of the house and the trees' leaves making noise all the time made it hard to hear any movement inside. When Mason knocked again, he said that he was there and that he was in charge. He was used to having people listen to his loud voice, but there was also a note of professional respect, as if the person knew how serious the issue was. The door slowly opened. The dim light from the lamp behind Rosie made her stand out in the hallway. The way her clothes and hair were styled made her face look very different from the rest of her body. She first looked at the sheriff and then at the guys standing around her. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, and there was no sign of panic or fear in it. She told them she knew why they were there because she had been. She was ready to go with them and was waiting for them. Mason asked for permission to look around inside the house. Rosie just took a small step away from the door to show that she agreed. The sheriff slowly walked in, followed by Daniel, who he had asked to join him as a witness from the public. While keeping a polite but watchful distance, the deputies stayed outside with Rosie. Mason carefully looked at every part of the cabin from the inside. He looked at the floor's stains and the wall's designs. Those notebooks stacked up. He looked through some of them quickly, and as he read the detailed notes, his face got darker. He asked Daniel to show him the shed, and the two of them walked through the pouring rain. The inside of the shed made even the experienced sheriff react in a clear way. He stood there with his jaw clenched for a long time, just watching. He looked at the tools, the jars, and the marked table. When Daniel pointed out the floorboards that were coming loose, Mason gave a serious nod and went down into There is a lamp in the ground. He stayed down there for almost 10 minutes, which was long enough to look at the evidence carefully without moving it. Even though he had a lot of experience, his face was pale when he came out. His small group of men wasn't up to the task, so he told Daniel that he would need to bring in more men. He said he would send a message to the state capitol asking for special detectives. This wasn't a normal case of crime in the country. There were issues that needed skills, more than what he could give. When they got back to the cabin, Rosie was waiting in a chair with her helpers on either side of her. The rain had slowed down to a steady drizzle. Mason sat down across from her at the table, pulled out a notebook from the pocket of his coat, and got ready to ask questions. But before he could start, Rosie raised her hand to ask everyone to be quiet. She told them she had to tell their story and she wanted to do it her way, without anyone getting in the way. Mason thought for a moment, then agreed, sometimes. Structured interrogations didn't show as much as letting a suspect talk freely. While Rosie took a big breath, she fixed her eyes on something far away, as if she were not looking at the present but at a place from the past. Then she started to talk. In the quiet of that mountain cabin, her voice became almost hypnotic. She said she was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and her father was a well-known doctor who worked at a university hospital. She had been interested in health since she was a child, but at a time when medical schools didn't let many women in. For the time, her father was pretty forward-thinking, so he set her up to work as a helper in his lab. While she was there, Rosie became very interested in anatomy and preserving tissue. In 1898, when she was 22 years old, her father got her a job at a private institution that did medical study. Rosie worked there for almost 10 years and learned advanced techniques for preserving artifacts, studying how bodies are put together, and adding to research. That would save lives in the long run. It was work she loved, work that gave her life value. But then something happened, which she didn't go into full depth, that involved research that wasn't ethical. The school was suddenly shut down by the government in 1908. Some of the researchers were caught, while others just vanished. Rosie's image was ruined by being linked to the crime, even though she wasn't directly involved. She couldn't go to any hospital or college. Because he felt bad, her dad stopped talking to her. She was left by herself. Without the right to use the information and skills she had gained, she moved from town to town for years, working odd jobs to make money while always hiding her past. But she never lost the desire to use what she knew to keep doing the work she thought was her calling. In the end, in 1915, she went to the woods of Kentucky to get away from everyone. She wanted to be alone and build something that looked like her old lab so she could keep studying without being watched. Roz's voice shook a little as she spoke. The next part. She said that at first she only wanted to study animal fossils and keep improving methods of preservation, but she went in a different direction because she was lonely, angry about lost years, and maybe even feeling something darker that she couldn't fully name. She started to think about the options she had never been able to properly investigate because of moral and social norms. When visitors who weren't going anywhere in particular went through the area since Rosie didn't have anyone to talk to about them, she started to see them not as people, but as chances to keep working on the project she had to stop and show to herself that what she knew was valuable, even if that value was skewed by her anger and loneliness. At that point, Sheriff Mason spoke up and asked how many people were involved. His voice was tense. Rosie shut her eyes for a long time before she spoke. 6 over 18 months. Each one was carefully written down in her notes. Each. She recorded the process with the clinical accuracy she had learned many years before. She said these were not violent acts done on the spur of the moment, but rather the continuation of scientific study. But she knew that everyone would never see it that way. Daniel felt sick when he heard how coldly Rosie talked about what she did. She saw the victims as things to study, which was very different from how she felt about them as people. In an incredibly professional way, the sheriff asked about the names of these people. Rosie said that most of the time she didn't know their real names. They were drifters or temporary workers who she convinced to stay in her cabin in the middle of nowhere during storms or cold nights because they thought she was kind. Rosie went into technical details about the crimes for more than an hour, but she never talked about the exact times of the deaths. Even though her story was skewed, she wouldn't seem to cross a certain line when she spoke. Mason was always taking notes, and his face showed that he was in charge of his work. When Rosie was finally done, there was a thick blanket of silence that was only broken by the sound of rain. Last but not least, the sheriff spoke. His voice was heavy with the weight of his duty. He told Rosie that she was being held in county jail because she was suspected of killing more than one person. He also said that she would have an official trial after the investigations were over. Rosie. She just nodded as if she had been expecting those words, as if what she was about to say was something she had always known would happen. In the days that followed, that peaceful part of the Kentucky woods turned into a hub of activity that had never been seen before. Sheriff Mason kept his word and sent texts to the capital asking for specific help. Within a week, state investigators, a medical examiner, and government record keepers showed up. Ropes and warning signs were put around Rose's land, while teams carefully organized every item, note, and piece of proof. During this time, Daniel stayed in the area and helped out and served as a witness when needed. He saw how quickly and efficiently the inspectors worked, taking pictures of everything and numbering each vial, tool, and notebook page. It was the right amount of slow and careful for the job. Not in a case this big, there could be no mistakes. The group had a lot of different responses to the full, a reveal of what had taken place among them. Some locals felt bad that they hadn't done anything sooner and had ignored the signs that were so clear now. Martha Coleman held this weight the most, saying over and over that she should have been more insistent and called the police sooner. Others remembered that in the mountains, respecting other people's privacy was a strongly held tradition, and that no one could have known how much Roz would do. What Thomas Brennan found, putting himself in a tough spot. He felt partly guilty because he gave Rosie a lot of the things she used, even though he hadn't done anything wrong legally. He couldn't sleep at night because he kept going over every transaction and talk in his mind, looking for clues he should have seen. Investigators talked to him a lot about the purchase records and used what they learned to make a timeline of events. The county jail put Rosie in solitary confinement and watched her all the time. Sheriff Mason was afraid she might try to kill themselves, which has happened before with prisoners facing major charges. But Rosie seemed strangely calm, almost happy. She worked with the police fully, answering technical questions about her notes and going over steps when asked. Her clinical coolness stayed the same, as if she were talking about real scientific studies instead of horrible crimes. Investigators tried to find the victims, but it was hard because those people were always moving around. By preserving things that were found. Along with the remains in the basement, they were able to figure out who the bodies belonged to. In April 1916, a traveling hardware seller went missing. His family in Tennessee looked for him for more than a year, but couldn't find him. Nobody had reported him missing because no one knew his family. He was a traveling sawmill worker. A woman who seemed to be moving because she was running away from a bad situation at home and didn't have any ties to one place. There were sad stories of lives cut short that went along with each identity. Promise that wasn't used. Some of these investigations included Daniel, who used his skills from his time as a private detective to help put the pieces together. It was hard on my emotions, but the work had to be done. The names of these people should be cleared up. They should be recognized as people, not just as victims who no one knows. Newspapers from outside the region wrote about the story. News reporters from bigger towns started to show up, eager to find shocking information. Sheriff Mason was very smart and tightly controlled the flow of information, giving them only what they need and keeping their privacy as much as possible. Neither did he let people take pictures of the house, nor did he give out specific information from Rosie's notebooks. The story was scary enough without any extraneous details. The small town tried to deal with things and move on at the same time. People got together at the nearby church to talk about their thoughts and fears and try to figure out what had happened. An old man named Reverend Clark was the preacher. He spoke words of comfort and time to think. He talked about how bad things can happen in strange places, how important it is for communities to be vigilant and caring at the same time, and how people should forgive even when it seems impossible. Daniel was at a turning point in his life. He had finished valuing the land, so there was no reason for him to stay. However, he felt like he had a bond with those people in that place that he hadn't had in years. There was something about that group and how they worked together to get through hard times that made him feel something deep inside. The landlord, Eleanina Price, said one night that he seemed to have found purpose again, which was something that he clearly didn't have when he first got there. This case was set to happen in December 1917. The hearing would take place in the courts in the county seat, which doesn't see many cases of this length. Both the prosecution and the defense were given lawyers, but everyone knew that Rose's full confession pretty much meant the result would be found guilty. The question is, it shouldn't be guilt or innocence, but the right punishment. Daniel went to see Rosie in jail in the days before her trial. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to. Maybe he was trying to understand something that he wasn't getting. The bars kept them apart, and the dim afternoon light came in through the cell's small, high window. Rosie asked about the neighborhood because she was genuinely interested in how people were responding. Daniel gave an honest answer, saying he felt shocked, sad, and makes an effort to learn. Then Rosie asked him a question that made him think. She asked him if he thought she was bad. Daniel kept quiet for a long time while he thought about what to say. Finally, he said that he didn't believe in pure evil, but in choices that made people go down darker and darker roads. He told her that she had skills and knowledge that could have helped people, but that her anger and loneliness had turned those gifts into something terrible. Rosie heard without showing any emotion, and then nodded, slowly, as if they agreed with the evaluation. The subject turned to Rose's past and the unusual ways she learned medicine during her formative years. She talked longingly of the time she felt like she was making a difference in the world. You could feel the sadness in her voice as she talked about how everything had fallen apart and how she had been kicked out of the only world she knew. She didn't say this as an excuse. She just gave Daniel some background. Daniel listened, seeing the complicated humanity in someone who did such horrible things. Daniel finally got out of jail just as the sun was going down, sending long shadows across the small town streets. He was strangely sad because he knew a lot of things that he wasn't sure how to handle. Rosie Hale was both a victim and a perpetrator at the same time. She had lost her potential because of her circumstances and the choices she made. They weren't any easy answers. They were just the tangled truth of human nature at its most upsetting. As the trial got closer, it looked like shut down the case officially in some way. Daniel knew, though, that it would take a lot longer to really understand and heal. For the people in the community, the families of the victims who could be named, and everyone else who had been affected by that sad story in the Kentucky mountains, winter was coming. The trails would be covered in snow, which would make the mountains even more alone. But even when it was cold outside, everyone would remember the secrets that were told. They would be permanent memories. That dark spots can be found even in the most beautiful places. It's winter in the mountains now, and the snow makes it very quiet because it blocks out all sounds. For weeks, the trails could not be used, and the small town went back to its normal pattern of being alone during the winter. Daniel chose to stay until spring, working and staying at Eleanina Price's boarding house, which had become like a second home to him. The events of that fall changed something very important. In that area, people started to talk to each other and check on each other more often. People used to take being alone without question, but now they didn't see it that way. People still valued each other's privacy, but they were more aware than ever that community was more than just living close to each other. While the legal process went on, Ross's property stayed empty and was blocked off by the officials. No one dared to get close, and over time, plants took back the room. It looked like the trees were leaning over the cabin, as if nature were trying to hide it so that it would be lost to history over time. Daniel thought about everything he had seen for many nights. He thought about how choices affect people's lives and how talents can be used for good or bad based on the situation and the person's choices. He also thought about how short lives are and how easily they can end if someone takes the wrong turn at the wrong time. Martha Coleman set up monthly get-togethers at the church, get-togethers where people just talked, told stories, and kept in touch with each other. They weren't always religious or formal gatherings. They were just times to get to know each other and remember they weren't alone in those huge mountains. They saw that being alone could be dangerous for everyone, not just the person who was alone. When spring finally came, Daniel finally got ready to leave. That was the end of his time there, and he was ready to move on to other places and events. While they were still tired strangers months before, a lot of people from the neighborhood came to say goodbye on the morning of his departure. Thomas Brennan offered food and water for the trip. While Eleanina Price was crying, Samuel Pritchard drew a detailed plan of the best routes. She then hugged him. Daniel took one last look back as he rode down the path. The mountains stood tall and proud against the blue sky of spring. Their sides were covered in different shades of green from new plants. It grew. The scenery was stunningly beautiful, but he knew that the memory of what those shadows showed him would always stay with him. When stories come out of the mountains, they often have a weight that words can't fully describe. These stories make us think about how complicated people are, and how every choice walks a fine line between light and dark. It's important to remember what happened in those faraway lands, even in the most remote places where we think we are far from thee. When we judge the world, the results of our actions will finally reach the light. After many years, that group would move on, stronger from the hard times it had been through. The cabin would finally fall apart, and the forest would take it back, leaving only a vague mark in the landscape. But the lessons would live on in people's memories and be passed down from generation to generation as a warning about the risks of being completely alone and cut off from other people. Thus, in the hills of people still tell stories in Kentucky where the wind still blows through the pines and the morning mist still comes from the valleys. Stories that tell us to look out for each other, keep the lines of communication open, and never let the darkness of loneliness grow without being seen. If this trip through the dark secrets of the mountains moved you, you might want to subscribe to the channel to see more stories that go into forgotten parts of history. Also, tell us in the comments how your group stays strong. Bonds even when things are hard. Until the next story.